He screamed over a teddy bear. Let that sink in before we go anywhere else. A prince in his 40s, red-faced and raging, not over a national crisis, not over a security breach, but because a housekeeper placed a stuffed animal 1 inch off its laminated blueprint. That's the image you need burned into your mind before we unravel everything else. Because this story doesn't begin with courtrooms or handcuffs or global headlines. It begins with entitlement so deep, so unchecked, that an entire household learned to tiptoe around it. And once you understand the bears, you understand the man.
Prince Andrew would fly off the handle if we've not opened the gate for him in time, or if we've stopped one of his guests because we've not got the right ID or we haven't been given any information of who they are. It would be verbally abusive. Shout, swear, just a really rude individual.
A grown man in his 40s screaming at housekeepers, not because they broke something valuable, not because they were late, because they put a stuffed animal in the wrong spot. That's the opening image you need to hold in your head for the rest of this video. Because everything that came after, the news interview, the lies, the settlement, the arrest, it all traces back to the same thing. A man who believed the world existed to serve him, and a household that was trained to never ever push back that. Now, let's talk about the man who said he saw it all. Not a blogger, not a YouTube conspiracy theorist. An armed protection officer who spent 6 years inside Buckingham Palace guarding the Queen, guarding Prince Philip, guarding Andrew himself.
And this, I think, is what is totally frustrating members of the royal family. He has always had a sense of entitlement. He's always been convinced by his royalness.
Young lady turned up, probably about 22, 23 years old, said she was here to see Prince Andrew. He just came in about half hour previous, so we knew he was in, but the footman wasn't answering his phone. There was no way of us contacting anyone up there, so we just politely said to the lady, "We're really sorry, we can't let you in at the moment because we can't confirm you're expected." So she said, "Oh, shall I ring him on my mobile?" So we said, "Yeah, fine." So she rang Prince Andrew on her mobile and we could hear him clearly. He said, put an officer on the phone. So my colleague took the phone and he said, "Listen to me, you fat lardy ass. Let my guest in immediately, I'm going to come down there." Everyone heard it. The lady went red, apologised, and we just let her in. So after that, obviously, those sort of issues we had with him, we would just let women in. Didn't ask questions because we just did not want to grief.
Paul Page was an armed protection officer in the Royalty Protection Command from 1998 to 2004, 6 years inside Buckingham Palace. He guarded the Queen, he guarded Prince Philip, and he guarded Andrew. 6 years inside the most protected household in Britain, and when asked which royal was the worst, he didn't hesitate. Not difficult, not high maintenance, the worst.
Ghislaine Maxwell, she was a very frequent guest of Prince Andrew. She was a regular visitor.
Of every royal he worked with, he says Andrew was the worst. Not difficult, not demanding. The worst, verbally abusive, explosive over nothing, and surrounded by a system that made sure nothing he did ever had consequences. Many complaints were made about him. He was a rude, obnoxious, horrible individual, but no one was going to take a complaint to the royal household because he was the Queen's favorite. And before anyone rolls their eyes and says, "Oh, he's just bitter," wait, because what makes this impossible to shrug off isn't rage, it's detail. And here's where the story turns from ugly to surreal. Because Page didn't just accuse Andrew of tantrums. He described a bedroom that sounded less like a duke's quarters and more like a museum exhibit for plush toys.
On this particular occasion, went into Prince Andrew's bedroom and his apartments, and on his bed was 72 teddy bears on his bed.
He described a bedroom containing roughly 50 to 60 soft toys arranged on Andrew's bed according to a laminated diagram, a printed laminated chart showing exactly where each bear sat. My inspector showed me a laminated card in the side drawer of one of the bedroom cabinets, a picture of these teddy bears all in situ. If the maids moved one during cleaning and didn't put it back precisely, Andrew would reportedly scream, not complain. Scream. Nobody invents a laminated teddy bear blueprint. That's not how grudges work. That's the kind of oddly specific, painfully embarrassing detail that only exists if you've seen it with your own eyes. And that's when you start noticing a pattern, not just of entitlement, but of insulation. Complaints went nowhere. Staff stayed silent. And above it all was the protective shadow of a mother who, by most accounts, adored him. Then came the interview that detonated everything. The one that should have been a simple PR exercise and instead became a global spectacle. Allegations were laid out in stark detail. He denied knowing the woman, denied meeting her, denied sweating. Yes, sweating. She says she met you in 2001. She dined with you. She danced with you. You bought her drinks. You were in a nightclub in London. And she went on to have sex with you in a house in Belgravia belonging to Ghislaine Maxwell. Didn't happen. I have no recollection of ever meeting this lady. In November 2019, Andrew sat across from Emily Maitlis and delivered one of the most infamous claims claims in modern broadcast history. He said he couldn't sweat, a peculiar medical condition, he claimed, linked to an adrenaline overdose from the Falklands War. That was his defense against allegations that he danced with a young woman who later accused him of far worse. She described dancing with you and you profusely sweating. There's a slight problem with the sweating, he said, because I have a peculiar medical condition, which is that I don't sweat. It should have ended there. It should have been so outrageous that the narrative collapsed under its own absurdity. But then Paul Page watched that interview and he laughed, not because it was funny, but because he remembered something very specific. A golf course, a hot summer day, a prince wiping his brow. Why would you remember that moment? Because he had a police officer picking up golf balls. It stuck in my mind. It was a hot summer's day. I was sweating. He was whacking golf balls. If you're wiping your brow, what are you wiping off your face? As far as I'm concerned, he was sweating. That's what I saw. The sweating almost became a punchline. Memes exploded. Late night comedians feasted. But the deeper issue wasn't perspiration. It was credibility. Because inside palace walls, according to Page, staff knew the claim was ridiculous. Yet no one stepped forward publicly to contradict it. Not immediately. Not forcefully. Silence did the protecting again. Now here's the twist they love to throw back at Page, his criminal record. He was convicted in 2009 for a $3 million property fraud. He went to prison. He admits it. I got myself into a lot of trouble when I was a royal protection officer. I was dealing in shares. I became a millionaire. Then I started losing money. I turned to fraud. I went to court. I was held to account. I spent 6 years in prison. And that's the convenient shield, isn't it? Discredit the messenger. Label him bitter, criminal, disgruntled. But here's what's uncomfortable. The palace has never directly denied the teddy bears, never denied the screaming, never formally dismantled the sweating contradiction. They attack the man. They leave the details hanging in the air unanswered. He insists he's not on a revenge mission. He says he suffered. That young girl suffered, that staff suffered, that police officers suffered, and that fear kept mouths shut. He calls it bigger than personal misconduct, hints at something darker, something brushing up against national security. And suddenly, this isn't just palace gossip anymore. It's structural, it's systemic. And then, just when critics try to dismiss it all as one ex-officer's vendetta, along comes someone far harder to wave away. A Cambridge-educated historian who spent 4 years interviewing 3,000 people, with hundreds going on record. He wrote a best-selling book detailing the rise and fall of the House of York, covering finances, scandals, and connections that reached into the orbit of Jeffrey Epstein. It took me 4 years of research. About 300 people talked to me. Many were appalled by the way Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson had been protected by the palace. I was able to reveal that she was in touch with Epstein for years afterwards, staying in his flats. The book sold well in the UK. American rights were bought for a reported $250,000 advance. Editors said the material was solid. Then, abruptly, the contract was terminated. Manuscript labeled unacceptable. Full revision period denied. Lawsuit filed. He claims legal letters warned publishers they were being watched. He claims intimidation. Archives blocking access. Friends allegedly told not to cooperate. No signed letter saying kill this book. No smoking gun memo. Just a pattern. Access denied. Deals collapsed. Broadcasters backing away. And you start to feel that same pressure Page described. Not loud, not obvious, but heavy. And then you have investigative biographers calling the infamous interview a masterclass in deceit, describing a face rehearsed for denial, warning that future revelations could trigger a constitutional crisis. A single line echoes everywhere. This is the chapter they hoped would never be written. 3 different men, a protection officer with baggage, a historian with credentials, a biographer known for taking on the powerful. Different backgrounds, different motives, same undertone that when the full truth about Andrew edges too close to daylight, something pushes back. And here's the part that chills the room. Queen Elizabeth II stood by him publicly for years, stripped him of duties, yes, but sheltered him, allowed him to remain at Royal Lodge, maintained proximity. By most accounts, he was her favorite. That shield lasted until her final years, and then she was gone. February 2026. Arrest, suspicion of misconduct in public office, search warrants executed, devices seized from Royal Lodge and Wood Farm, the National Crime Agency involved, commentators whispering that this could be the biggest crisis since the abdication. And suddenly all those voices, Page, the historian, the biographer, don't sound fringe anymore. They sound early. Because what if the teddy bears weren't just eccentricity? What if they were a metaphor? A man obsessed with control, with arrangement, with a world that bent around him, and an institution that quietly made sure it did. And here's where it stops being about eccentric habits and starts becoming something far more dangerous. Because when protection collapses, truth rushes in like floodwater through a cracked dam, and suddenly the same institution that once insulated him finds itself scrambling to distance itself from him. February 2026 didn't just bring headlines, it brought officers through gates that had not been crossed with that kind of intent in generations. Search warrants weren't symbolic, they were executed. Hard drives weren't rumors, they were seized. Laptops, phones, archive devices from Royal Lodge and Wood Farm were cataloged and carried out under legal authority. For decades, critics whispered that the monarchy shielded Andrew. In that moment, shielding ended. And what made it seismic wasn't simply that a duke was under suspicion, it was that the unthinkable had finally become procedural. The National Crime Agency became involved. Legal commentators began comparing the gravity to 1936, not because of romance or abdication this time, but because institutional credibility was on the line. The question that hung in the air wasn't whether Andrew had weathered scandals before. He had. It was whether this time the machinery that once cushioned him would step back entirely. Insiders murmured that the atmosphere shifted dramatically after the Queen's death. While she was alive, critics claimed there was always a layer of deference around him. Not immunity, not officially, but proximity. A sense that moving too aggressively would fracture something sacred. But once that protective gravity vanished, the dynamic changed. King Charles publicly insisted the law must take its course. Behind palace doors, it was whispered that Prince William had grown increasingly firm that Andrew could no longer be a liability orbiting the core of the crown. The family, long accused of circling wagons, now appeared to be repositioning them. But repositioning doesn't erase history, and history is what investigators start digging through when devices are seized. Years of communications, financial trails, associations, networks. The very things biographers and historians claimed they were blocked from fully accessing now potentially sitting in evidence bags. For 2 decades, the narrative around Andrew oscillated between denial and containment. Allegations emerged. Denials followed. Interviews were staged. Settlements were reached. Titles were adjusted. Public appearances minimized. But nothing ever felt fully resolved. It felt paused, suspended, like a clock ticking behind a wall panel nobody wanted to pry open. And when that panel is finally removed, you don't control what spills out. The sweating claim, once a global punchline, suddenly became emblematic of something larger. Not because perspiration mattered, but because it symbolized how easily implausible explanations were delivered with confidence. Critics call that interview a catastrophe, not simply because of its content, but because of its composure. The certainty. The calm denial. The assertion that memory simply did not cooperate. And when former insiders insisted they had witnessed contradictory realities, the palace strategy appeared consistent. Question credibility, avoid granular rebuttal. The teddy bears were never officially denied. The screaming was never formally litigated in public statements. The sweating was never countered with a detailed timeline. Instead, the spotlight moved. Until it couldn't. Paul Burrell, who had lived within palace walls during Diana's era, had long spoken about institutional instinct. Protect the crown first, individuals second. He described a machine that prioritizes continuity over confrontation. That doesn't require villainy, it requires survival logic. Monarchies endure by absorbing scandal quietly, not exploding publicly. But what happens when the scandal becomes too heavy to absorb? When legal systems outside the palace perimeter insist on process. That's when tradition meets modern scrutiny. That's when whispers turn into depositions. And here's the part that rattles even seasoned observers. Multiple independent voices from different professions converged on the same description over years. Entitlement. Insulation, aggression towards staff, protection from consequences. Whether one chooses to believe every allegation or not, the repetition itself becomes significant. Patterns matter, especially when those patterns span decades and are echoed by people with no shared incentive. The arrest on suspicion of misconduct in public office shifted the tone globally. It reframed Andrew not as a disgraced royal quietly sidelined, but as a subject within a legal framework that operates independently of lineage.